Ilse Kleinman was born in Berlin, Germany in June 1925. Her parents, Bruno and Friedel Rosenthal, welcomed their second daughter 2 years later. Her father was proud of his German heritage. He was a soldier in the First World War and was awarded the Iron Cross for bravery, emerging from the war as a hero. When the Nazi movement began gaining prominence, Bruno Rosenthal was keenly aware of pending trouble for the Jewish people. His wife Friedel had a brother who had left Germany as a youth and settled in South Africa after the First War. He had encouraged the couple, who at that time were childless, to join him, which they had half-heartedly considered but declined to do so at the time. As the Nazi regime gained more and more popularity, Bruno and his wife started thinking about the idea of leaving this growing movement of anti-Semitism behind and starting new lives in a faraway, strange land, now with 2 young children. But struggling with this dilemma, he kept telling his family that they should not be too concerned, as he was a decorated war hero and expected that they would not suffer too much oppression as a result. But on January 30th, 1933, the day that Hitler won the chancellorship as Germany's leader, he made a decision that the family would depart the land of their birth.
Today is the day of decision. Hitler came to power. We are going to leave Germany.
In November of 1933, the family left Berlin from the Bahnhofstrasse to take a train to Calais, where they would board a ferry for the United Kingdom.
When we left, the train pulled out of Berlin. I say to my eldest daughter, she was 7, remember this day.
At the end of November, they boarded a ship named the Armadale Castle in Southampton for the 2-week journey to South Africa. The family settled in Cape Town and began building their new lives. In some of her writings, Ilse recounted portions of her youth in Cape Town, where she wrote about how her father felt like a deaf mute, as he could not speak or understand English. But in spite of all their problems, there was always the realization that what they had done was right, that they were glad that they had left Germany so that their children could grow up in freedom. She recounts that life in South Africa at that time was uncomplicated and peaceful. There was little stress, and there were opportunities to fulfill one's yearnings in any way one wanted. Although she was never exposed to the discrimination and cruelty in Germany, it later became apparent that Ilse's parents' tension and anxieties must have had a profound effect on her. Once, when she was a teenager whilst traveling on a bus, she heard German spoken by 2 women and had a violent physical reaction. She became dizzy and sick, and at the first traffic light jumped off the bus and waited for the next one. She remained prone to those spontaneous reactions during her life when re-stimulated by elements of the Nazi ideology. In her late teens, Ilse became involved in music and singing and began thinking of a career in that field. She met her husband, Sidney Kleinman, when she was 16 years old, and they married just before she turned 20. At this stage of her artistic career, she began drawing, which led her to painting and some sculpture. They decided to start a family. However, it was a 13-year struggle before she gave birth to her first son, with a second son born 15 months later. Her love of art was all-consuming, and with 2 young children, Ilse began studying fine arts at the University of Cape Town and obtained her degree in 1965. But all the while, the political structure in South Africa was affecting her psyche. She wrote in one of her memoirs that when the Nationalist Party in South Africa became the ruling party in 1948, their racist laws were harshly directed against all races that were not white. The Jewish people also felt very apprehensive, since those in the ruling party had supported Hitler during the war as they were anti-British. The Jews in South Africa were afraid that after the government had achieved its goal of isolating the black people in the country, history would repeat itself and Jews would once again become victims. Those opposing this ideology had a feeling of doom, and there was a premonition of disaster for the future. Not willing to sit by on the sidelines, Ilse and her husband Sidney became involved in opposing contentious legislation and demonstrated as they could. They became founding members of the Progressive Party, which was against apartheid and all forms of racism. She also joined the Black Sash, a powerful women's movement. They once stood in front of the Houses of Parliament throughout the night, wearing their sashes of mourning, but their cries went unheard. Once, standing on the steps of the Cape Town Cathedral near the Houses of Parliament together with students from the university, protesting more oppressive legislation, she witnessed firsthand how force was applied and the effects thereof. It was a peaceful demonstration. Everyone stood quietly and did nothing to provoke the attack the police launched on them with batons and tear gas. She never forgot the bestial expressions on the faces of the police, and profoundly shaken, with eyes streaming, she limped home. She was overcome with anguish at the brutality she had witnessed and went into her studio and, without a thought in her head, began to paint. She worked feverishly, and after a few hours an image appeared. It was a man's head, and he was muzzled. Next to him was a fist beating down. All her emotions and impressions went into that painting, which she felt expressed hopelessness and frustration that many people in South Africa were beginning to feel. Through the 60s, Ilse's work was beginning to being recognized in the South African art world, and in 1965 she had her first exhibition of paintings and graphics. An art critic wrote, "Ilse Kleinman's paintings show a strong expressive trend of high standard. She's been painting for some time and already found her feet in this field." In the Cape Times newspaper on July 1, 1968, the following review was published. It should be stated that the second exhibition by Ilse Kleinman, on view until July 5th, reflects tremendous progress in the artist's development. She continued working feverishly through the rest of the 60s, with further exhibitions in both Cape Town and Johannesburg, and in July 1970, she had her first overseas exhibition in London at the Ansdale Gallery, with the second exhibition at the same gallery a year later. She also exhibited her work in Germany, in both Frankfurt and Hanover. But discontent continued whilst living in South Africa. The brutal killing in a South African prison of Stephen Biko, a young black consciousness leader, affected her deeply. They wanted to leave South Africa in order not to be a part of the brutality and repressive legislation orchestrated by fanatic nationalist Afrikanerdom. So departure plans began to take shape. Their younger son, who had traveled whilst a student to the United States in 1978, visited Los Angeles and decided to return in April of 1979. In July of 1979, her father, Bruno Rosenthal, died at the age of 91. In an effort to keep the family together, Ilse and her husband Sidney emigrated to the United States in December of that year and settled in Santa Monica. Their eldest son, who had just graduated from the University of Cape Town, would meet them there in January 1980. With the family intact and now living in the US, they began to learn more about the reality of what was happening in South Africa at that time, because whilst living in the country, due to strict censorship of the media, they did not know the extent of the brutality that was being directed at the black population. Black South Africans were suffering cruelty, torture, indignities, and death. They were being victimized and exploited. Once again, history was repeating itself. Ilse felt guilty and depressed for having been a part of that corrupt society. As an artist, she began to express herself in the way she knew best. Childhood memories came to the fore, and she began to understand even more clearly her parents' isolation and their periodic despondency. Claude Lanzmann's documentary on the Holocaust, Shoah, was broadcast on public television, and it proved to be a powerful stimulus to release pent-up emotions and memories. And as they began to surface, she was drawn to what her parents had been through so many years before. Many works of art were born as a result of those feelings, and a flood of creativity burst forth. All works were strongly expressionistic and symbolic of suffering, resulting in a large body of paintings and drawings. As she continued working on establishing herself as an artist in the US, she realized that she had created a collection which she aptly named the Holocaust series, focusing on man's inhumanity to man. She initiated 3 private showings of the work, and during one of the showings, a journalist who had sat silently for 1.5 hours reviewing the work said to her, "How could you identify so strongly with this suffering when you weren't even there? How is it you did not go insane?" In 1989, in conjunction with the Holocaust Remembrance Week, the series was exhibited in Vancouver, Canada at the Zach Gallery, part of the Jewish Community Center. A survivor from Auschwitz who had opened the exhibition by telling his story later embraced her and said to her, "There will come a time when there will be no more survivors to tell the tale, but your work must endure for posterity." Though humble at having received this affirmation of her work from the man, she realized that the work had touched a lot of people and made a strong impression. In preparing for this documentary and the exhibition that you are viewing, a statement of what art and creative work meant to Ilse Kleinman was uncovered, and she wrote,
"I paint in order to give meaning to my life. Why does a poet write? Why does a musician compose? These creative activities have been a need for man to endeavor to understand and express the inexpressible. A basic need of all life forms is to create, change, and thus move on to greater forms of growth. When I am confronted with a blank canvas, there is a feeling of uncertainty, of anxiety, of adventure. I do not know where it's going to lead me. I only know that there are no limitations, and I know that in some way I will be guided and shown the way. Therefore, I do not give titles to my paintings, for to do so would impose a limited version on myself, and thus also on the viewer. It is in the final moment of creating, when I have lost all consciousness of self, that I am aware that man has been created in the image of God."
The works of art that are viewed here were created intuitively and emotionally and were not planned out. Although they portray the darker side of life, it was the artist's desire that they somehow embody positive aspects of life. Ilse Kleinman died in April 2012 at the age of 86, leaving behind a collection of work that through her lifetime exemplifies her thinking, represents the essence of her soul, as well as how she lived among her fellow man, always delving deeply into her understanding of the meaning of life and her own life, intertwined with it.